I just want to tell you a little bit story about our first presenter because I like to tell this story. So Glenn Stutzky, and I'll reintroduce him when he finally gets here. Oh, he is here now. So, but I still want to tell the story because this sets the bar of why I connected with Glenn. People are upset with a lot of things right now, and we see school board meetings and people are upset with masks and they're upset. But some of that, what we see as anger can actually be passion. And I think because we're passionate about what it is, our emotions can run high. Glenn Stutsky, I met him the first day when my passion kind of overflowed in a meeting because I had spent 6 months trying to get something done, and it was what I thought was simple. And I was that person at the lectern who was very, very upset at things. It was Glenn who caught me after the meeting and said, he goes, in a way, you're right, but you need to understand that this is a long road. It's going to be a hard road, and you have to understand that to kind of keep moving forward. So for me, Glenn Stutzky has been a friend. He has been a mentor to me to set me on the right path in what I'm doing. And so we've had Glenn on before, and it's great for him to come back. And now we are looking at a whole different paradigm of what our students are going to be involved in. So Glenn, I want to thank you for taking your time out for all you've done with all your research and work over bullying and harassment over the years. It's great to have someone in our own backyard. And even though I live a mile away from you, I haven't seen you in 2 years. How are you, sir?
Good. Yes, it has been almost 2 years now, hasn't it? I still remember the first time that I met Kevin. As he said, it was at a school board meeting, and I had been doing work on bullying for quite a while already at that point, and I was familiar to the school board members, and they invited me to come to the meeting. And the reason that they invited me, that I pretty quickly picked up on, is that there was this parent who was going to be there. That would be him. Yeah. And, the recent tragedy that had just happened, they weren't really sure what the heck to do or what to make of it. But honestly, I think they brought me in to kind of corral him or calm him down or, set him straight and stuff. But as I listened to him, and that was the very first time, my response was to the board is that this guy has a point and you need to listen. So I didn't get invited back very quickly to that group. And Kevin and I joined up, and it wasn't too long before we were even doing presentations together in schools in East Lansing and in other places. And as I think all of you are probably aware, Kevin has gone on to become an expert in his own right, all the way up to the national level, and has been working and was a key motivator and energizer for the law that was passed in regards to bullying, Matt's law. And that was a highlight in my life, the day we were standing in the governor's office and actually seeing that signed into law. So I'm very glad to be with you today. It has been, it has been a few years. And so is it okay to get started, Kevin? I don't know what else.
Yeah. We just had some people join. Thank you, Glenn, because I just want to reintroduce, as people are just now still joining us, Glenn Stutzky, Master's of Social Work, Michigan State University, expert in his own right in bullying and harassment. But what we're going to kind of focus on today, Glenn, you're going to talk to us about this new realm of what the students have kind of been living through in the pandemic, and what we need to be thinking ahead for in our schools and our communities. So I'm going to step in the background. Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Stutzky. Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Kevin. And if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Those will be being moderated by the folks there. And we're going to save some time at the end of my time to take as many questions as we can. But as I think Kevin already said, there may be a lot more questions. So please just keep sending them in throughout the whole day. And hopefully we can get back to addressing those and send out whatever information and resources we can. Just by a little bit of way of background, I have been at Michigan State over 20 some years, maybe it's 24, 25 years now. And my research and my experience has kind of gone in chapters, but they've all had kind of a common thread. And that's working with people and working with populations that have experienced trauma, violence in one form or another. That began with domestic violence for about a decade, in learning about the dynamics of the power and the control in domestic violence. That actually led me into the schools, because after working with the women for quite a few years and learning about domestic violence dynamics, we wanted to see how their children were doing who lived in those homes, how they were doing in school. And so I remember, I hadn't been involved with schools for a long time, following these kids in schools. And it was then that I saw that some of these children going into schools were kind of going along two paths. One, some of them were continuing to be harassed and intimidated, didn't even have the word bullying at the time, but they were victims, continuing to be victims in the school setting. Some of them actually became, perpetrators. But when I saw these kids in the schools, and this is like 20 some years ago or whatever, and no one was recognizing, they were like invisible. And I remember going to someone in the Department of Education, because I figured that they knew what was going on and I wanted to help out in any way that I could. But at that point, it was not seen. It wasn't recognized. And as I would explain to them what I saw and what I was hearing from the kids, it was just like a blank look on their face. So over a period of about a decade, many other people came into this fight on behalf of the children. Kevin, of course, being one of them, and we were able to raise the level of awareness. So that population, I saw that it wasn't just boys being boys, but there was actual harm occurring, and harm that actually approached the level and met the level of being traumatized. So I began working in the area with kids and with bullying, and seeing that as a traumatic event, not just as a one-time thing, not just as, peers kind of fighting amongst themselves, but truly a case, just like with domestic violence, issues of power and control and domination, manipulation, and harm coming to these children. So that kind of began the second chapter of my, work and research. The one that I'm currently in now that has very much similarities to this is working with combat veterans. I'm part of a team with Tina Thompson at Michigan State, where in the School of Social Work, we've created a certificate program that is Combat Veteran Certificate Program, working to help train social workers and other health professionals, work with these folks who have had some very unique experiences, and trauma has really become a part of their life. Now, this is all going to tie in, and I want to go back to a conversation that Jamie and I were having when we were talking about this gathering today, and she was extending an invitation for me to come. And she was sharing with me about how, as kids are coming back into the classrooms, coming back to school, coming back to being in person, they were seeing some unsettling behaviors, some bad behaviors amongst the kids. Now, there's always going to be a certain amount of, behavior as kids are out and around. But she was saying that this was above and beyond that, and that kids it wasn't just bad behavior between, one kid to another, but even kids towards teachers or kids towards adults. And the reality is, of course, and I'm sure all of us, especially here in this gathering, are aware of this, is that when school was no longer meeting in person, things were still happening with kids and to kids. Even before the pandemic, the majority of bullying is usually done online, cyberbullying. That didn't stop. In fact, that even increased. And kids had less respite from that. And in many ways, less resources to deal with it. Plus, their parents are also going through some very challenging and difficult times. But bad behaviors, rudeness, meanness, bullying, lack of, following instructions. Some of those things, of course, to a smaller degree we've seen, but this is even to a greater degree. And so it was like, what's going on? It's like empathy is decreasing and incivility is increasing. Things are getting too loud, too rude, too mean. And we're seeing these behaviors. And, what is it? And what are we to do? And that's when I began almost immediately really seeing some similarities. Now, I want to qualify this by saying so much of what is happening now is in the process of being studied, but it's going to be a few years before we have those professional studies, things that get published. So what I'm sharing with you today are things that I have learned over the last 20, 25 years about trauma and about bullying and about its impacts and about its challenges. And I'm using that experience in what I'm recognizing in what's happening with many kids today in schools. It's like when I went into the schools, I used what I saw in domestic violence to recognize what was bullying in schools. If you've been involved in the domestic violence work at all, you know about the power and control wheel. Well, I took that and I adapted it and brought it right into the schools because it was like the same thing. And it was happening, right there. I think I'm seeing some similarities with the kids as we're in this period of time in a pandemic and how it's impacting them. And I want to share a little bit about this, the impact of the pandemic on children and maybe some unique things. Because when it's down at the view of a child, it's different than with the adult. When we were working with domestic violence with the adults, primarily with the women, we initially thought that, well, whatever we do for the women, that'll just take care of the kids. It'll just kind of trickle down and it'll help the kids. We found out that, yes, some of that does trickle down, but they're their own unique person. And they have a different set of experiences with domestic violence and a different set of skills and resources to handle it or to not handle it. What I want to tell you is what I perceive is that children are experiencing the pandemic these last 18 months or so in some ways that are similar to us as adults, but also in some very unique ways. And I think in order to help and address the situation that we're seeing with some of our children, not all of them, we need to be able to have more of what their perspective is. One thing about the pandemic, I began to be concerned about right away when I saw that we were probably going to be, staying at home a lot more. Because of working in the field of domestic violence, I knew that the only break that often women got from their abusive person that was, their partner, was when he went to work. And it doesn't take much to realize that for nearly 2 years, domestic violence abusers, many of them haven't been going to work. Where have they been? They've been at home, living with an abuser 24 hours a day. You can't, for a period of time, you couldn't even go out of your house unless you're going to like a doctor's appointment and things like that. And in that situation, even if a child is not the direct recipient of like physical violence themselves, it has the same impact on them when they're living in that environment and when they see it, as well as also when they hear it and they're trapped. Also, levels of child physical abuse and sexual abuse is like being trapped in hell. And any possible reprieve you could get from that or resources you were cut off from in many ways. Oftentimes where abuse is first brought up is in schools, school social workers, school nurses, school psychologists, a teacher. A child brings something up. Well, that was gone. So that's a certain subset, of the children. But the pandemic, as it has affected all of us to different degrees as adults, it's also affected children, but in some different ways. Think about it, especially with the younger children. I remember watching and listening to my daughter-in-law. I was off a little bit of a ways, and I was hearing her. This was very early on. And she was giving the COVID talk, what I call the COVID talk, to her very young son, who was at that moment, they were still in school. This was really, early on. And I thought, wow, she's having to give a COVID talk to this very young person. I started thinking about what must he be thinking? And that's what I want for a few moments for you to think about. If you're a young child, you're 6 years old, 7 years old, and especially younger than that. When there's something that's a danger and your parents can say, watch out when you're crossing the street. You see that car coming down there? We've got to wait until it passes. It's starting to rain now and we're hearing thunder. There might be lightning. Come in. Danger has been able in many ways to be a tangible thing, oftentimes, that we can point out. But from a child's point of view, well, and to us too, but from a child's point of view, they can't see COVID. They can't see it. So they are hearing from their parents and others, it's out there, but they can't see it. They can't hear it. You might get it on your hands, but you can't feel it. You can't smell it, but you might breathe it in. And that's why you have to wear a mask. So it's like this danger that is not visible. It's not tangible. Talk about anxiety. That's very anxiety producing. I have some of that same anxiety, with the situation as well. But I think even more so, with the kids, we have to put ourselves in what, they have experienced. And the reality is that some of these kids have actually been orphaned by this pandemic. If they've been in a single, especially those who may have been in a single parent family. And there have been 700,000 plus people who have died. Some of those are grandparents. Many of those are also mothers and fathers. And the reality is too, many of those are now becoming kids. Kids are entering into that statistic. At first, we're like, oh, it's so good that COVID doesn't seem to care about kids. They're not catching it. If they catch it, they don't really get sick. Well, you know what? The reality is we weren't letting our kids out of the house. They weren't in school. They weren't having parties. They weren't gathering together. We really kept them protected at the beginning. And guess what? They didn't get it very often. That's not the case now. They are getting COVID. They are being hospitalized. And the most recent number I heard is about 3 children a day are dying from COVID. So death is a part of their experience as well. They may have had someone within the family, father, mother, grandparents, or someone like that, who's been sick or hospitalized, and in some cases has even died. So there is a huge impact like that. And then there's loss. And this is true for us too. There's been a lot of losses due to the pandemic, but I want to try to bring it in particular back to the losses that kids have experienced. I think one of the biggest losses is the loss of connection. And the loss of connection, I think, also is tied up with the loss and this decrease of empathy. Empathy is what grounds us and binds us in a relationship. It's what allows us and motivates us to be kind and to show kindness. And I think that loss of connection that we've had over such a long time has led to some of this, decrease in empathy. And it's kind of like a secular thing. Kids have not had these normal activities where they've been together. There's been a loss of activities, a loss of celebrations, a loss of certain, milestones in their life. And think about it. If you were a young child, if you have a 3-year-old child, half of their life has been spent in this pandemic. And that's why I titled this Children of the Pandemic. It's like a generation because it's not over yet. I mean, many places were acting like the pandemic is over and numbers are going down at the moment, but it's not over. It's not over yet. A winter is coming. If you have a 6-year-old, 25% of their life has been in this pandemic. So it's having, I think, some very foundational and systemic, impact on them. There's been losses in their lives, just like in ours, the loss of a lot of the friendships and stuff, and the importance of being able to grieve. I don't think we've given that enough attention either as adults and then especially for our children. Right now, what is it? Hurry up, get back to normal. We want you to come back to school. We want you to act like you did before the pandemic. We want you to sit down, be quiet, do your lessons, that type of thing. And it's like we've moved, we've moving on without having the time to acknowledge the losses and to grieve about them. I think another thing that kids have lost in some ways is their status and their sense of identity. Now, for us as adults, if you're like, I think it was, did I look at 60 years old or whatever? The pandemic has only been about 2% of your life. And our status, much of our status and our identity as adults is tied up in the things that we have accomplished. I have a PhD, I have a master's degree, I've done this, I've done that. I have this job. This job gives me status. This job gives me identity. I have money. I have possessions. And there's other things too that tie into identity, but as adults, we have that. Not so much for kids. A lot of their identity in those early years, yes, comes from family, but we're talking about school. It comes also from friends and being together and playing together. Think of play, especially for the younger children. Play is their work. You and I have our work. We go, we work, we get a certain sense of accomplishment. Sometimes we get acknowledgement, rewards, we get paid and things like that. A kid's work is play. They need that, as far as having that sense of identity. So here's what I'm saying, and I'm definitely want to make sure we have time for some questions if some questions are coming in. I think some children, not all, family dynamics, make a difference. There's so many different factors. A few years down the road, we'll know a lot more about this as it's being studied. But I think that some children have experienced individual trauma, but I think there's also a collective trauma, because as a society, we have been going through this experience together. Even though maybe we haven't been physically together as much, we're sharing the same set of circumstances. And this is where it began to remind me of some of the same things that I see with combat veterans. Many of them have been injured, not just physically, but they've been injured morally, or what Tina Thompson and I have recognized as moral injury. Things that they saw in combat, things that they did, things that they didn't do that they know that they should have. And it wounds their identity. It is another injury, but it's not PTSD. And it's one of the things that's driving the suicide rate, within the military, and keeping it so stable, because it hasn't really been recognized or dealt with. So individual people who have served in the military, especially those who have been in combat, have been traumatized. Not all of them, just like I'm saying, not all kids have been traumatized. But there's also a collective trauma that they have suffered with the group of men and women that they have been with. So there is a collective trauma amongst combat veterans. And so we have to help and figure out what to do, both for the individual, but also for the group. So what I'm posing for your consideration, and as I said, a few years down the road, we'll know a lot more if this is accurate or not, is that many children have been individually traumatized. They've suffered loss. Maybe they've had the opportunity to grieve, or maybe they haven't. And now they're being brought back to school, just like with the service members returning. The person comes back and it's like, we want you to be just like you've been. We want the good old, Kevin that there was before he went off to war. I mean, he looks the same, he doesn't have a physical, he looks the same, so we want you to come home. We want you to go out with your buddies, take a little bit of time off. Yeah, you were at war, that must have been hard. But I'm not really having the understanding about it. And then, okay, well, then we want you to get a job. Well, that person's having problems. They're having reactions. There's things going on, internally. And there is a trauma, a wound that has occurred to the spirit, and to the soul. That's one thing that I saw about bullying early on. Bullying just wasn't an outward physical activity. Bullying was something that went much, much deeper, that it wounded the spirit and it wounded the soul, because it went to your identity. And that is a deep wound. But just like we've wanted those who are returning from war, we want them, to, they can have a little bit of time to talk a little bit about, but then we want them to just, you can kind of stop talking about that now. Come on, get on with your life, get back, get a job, start thinking about getting married and things like that. And ignoring that collective trauma, that they have suffered. And so this might be a little bit different, but I want to refer you to a documentary and to a movie, because I believe it holds some very valuable things that we could learn and adapt to help our children with what they're experiencing now. We cannot just have them come back into the educational system as it has been for 100 plus years. You sit at your desk quietly, work on the sheet that we have here, stand up, get in a line, be quiet, go down to the cafeteria, don't be loud and things like that. That's just not happening. And for some children, again, who've not been impacted as much, that's going to work. But what do we do about classrooms or schools or those that are being impacted like this? How do we approach them? And the movie that I want to refer you to is called The Windemere Children. And that's spelled Windermere, children. Now, I don't think in 20 years I've ever recommended a movie, but I'm recommending it to us here as kind of our homework to look at for how we might approach this situation. There's also a documentary. That movie is an hour and a half. It was made in 2020 or released in 2020. There's also a documentary by the same name. It's called The Windemere Children, in their own words, where these children that I'll be telling you about in just a moment share their experiences in their own words. These are children. There was about 300 of them. They were the children of the Holocaust. Most of the children that were in the concentration camps were killed, and killed quickly, but some survived. And think about it again in terms of the amount of time of their life that was spent in a concentration camp where they were held captive under almost undescribable, conditions. And that was their life, especially for the very young ones. Well, about 300 of these children, after the war and after the camps were liberated, were brought to England to an estate near this lake, Windemere Lake. And there was a team of people, psychologists and counselors and others, that were going to work with them for 4 months to try to help them reintegrate into society from what they've experienced. Now, let me make it perfectly clear. I'm not saying that the children of the pandemic are identical to the children of the Holocaust. What I'm saying is that there are similarities I think we can learn from. Just like there are similarities between children who have the children of domestic violence have a lot of the same things that have been going on in their lives. And so in this movie, you will see a non-traditional approach to education. And this is what I'm putting forward to you today to take a look at, see the documentary, see the movie, and see how there might be some principles and even some concrete ideas that we can do to help these children reintegrate. Again, I'm not saying they're identical, but I'm saying that there's similarities. There was a loss of identity with the children of the Holocaust. I remember on the buses when they were being brought to this estate, and there was a gentleman that was greeting them, and he was talking to one of the children and asked, "What is your name?" And the child rolled up his sleeve to show his number because he didn't have a name. He only had a number. That loss of identity, the loss of control, the loss of freedom. There's a powerful scene when the kids are first there and they're brought, into the cafeteria for their first meal, and bread has been set out on the table, and all the kids are just like sitting there. I mean, they're still so anxious because so many of the things still kind of look like where they came from in many ways. And they're sitting there at the table, and then something is said so that they can start eating. Now the food hasn't been brought out. There's place settings for the hot food and stuff that's coming, but there's bread, bowls of bread. Once it is, I hate this as a spoiler, but once they say, okay, we're going to start eating, there's a mad dash where kids are grabbing the bread and knocking things over on the table and running back to their rooms. You know what they're doing? They're hiding the bread under the beds and behind the dressers and things like that. Now, the guy who's running this show, the program in that, is amazing. I wish I could have been there to help out and to see in person, but the response wasn't, "Oh, those kids, and they're behaving like mad kids," and stuff like that. That was so inappropriate. You know, they shouldn't have done that. Get them back here. Make them, you know, clean up this, you know, all these all this stuff that they've knocked over. And they're not going to have breakfast, because of this. And no, you know what his response was to the staff? Bring out more bread. Just keep bringing out bread. And so what I want to say is I think we have to have, and we're going to get to questions here in just like 2 minutes. We have to have a different mindset. It can't be normal educational process, normal educational policies. We've got to take a different approach. I've been using, and I'll close with this and open up with questions. I've got kind of my own saying, and I call it KPA, K-PA, kindness, patience, and adaptability. On March 11th, when I walked into Berkey Hall, about to start a class, all of our phones were going off. The president of the university said, as of noon, the university is shutting down, and he wanted everybody, to go home. And I had probably the most important and profound class I've ever had in all the years I've been at university. And it didn't have a damn thing to do with a textbook or a lecture. I moved from behind the podium. I came out, we sat in a circle. We talked about going home. We talked about who was at home. One student lived with his grandparents. He says, I'm not going home. I'm not going to take a chance. I'm bringing something home. And I said, everything changes now. Here's what's going to happen. There is no final exam in this class any longer. And we're removing this and we're removing that. And here's what we're going to do. Had to have a different mindset. And I think we may need the same thing now in some situations. Okay, Kevin, are you moderating the questions?
I am. I'm still I'm unpacking everything that you just kind of gave to us. I mean, there's so much in there when you talk about things I've thought about. The loss of connection is, a major thing. There's loss of status. Someone who probably left school when they were a freshman, they're coming back, as a junior. They've lost time, things that they've missed out on, and anxiety. Like you said, we've all have our own levels of anxiety throughout this, and that's personal. It's deeply personal. What affects me doesn't affect you. So it's not the same with our students, but it's great information. Yes, and we do have a slew of questions from you. And I'm going to kind of start backwards, but we'll get through these. So Emma from Gary would like to know, are we seeing collective trauma among educators too? Because that's something also I'm thinking of, and what you just pointed out in your class, it's not just our students, it is our teachers, it's our, people that are all involved in this, but how are the educators? Have we seen like that collective trauma as well?
I think we are. I really think we are early on, and I'll get right back to the educators. But early on, there was a woman who was a highly regarded, this was in, I believe, New York City, a highly regarded emergency room physician. And she'd been dealing with COVID, 24 hours a day for, several months. And she committed suicide. And part of what she said is that, she wasn't able to do everything that she could do to save these people. I think she experienced not just anxiety, but there was like a moral injury there too. As far as with educators, I think we are here's what I honestly think. I think that we're in a period where we're in survival mode. Now, I used to think of that as just kind of like a saying. More recently, I found out it's actually a state of being. It's not being burned out. It's not being tired. It's not just being frustrated. It's another level of existence. It's where the demands that are upon us exceed our capacity to meet them day after day after day. And you have now teachers like at Michigan State University, we're being forced to teach in person in some of us in very small classrooms. The university has decided to ignore the CDC guidelines for distancing. Yes, people have to wear masks and are supposed to be vaccinated. You just have to take their word for it, though. And we're in rooms that are ill-equipped as far as ventilation. So there's that ongoing anxiety. Plus, originally, we were going to be notified if someone in our class tested positive for COVID. The provost has now reversed that decision. We're not informed. I'm in a class, small class, not ventilated well, people within just a couple of feet of one another. Someone tests positive for COVID, I'm not notified.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that there is a collective trauma that exists among teachers, but there's this huge push. Get things back to normal. Get kids in their seats, get fans in the stands. We're about to start the basketball season now. We want everything full. Cafeterias full, everything full, everything back to normal.
And I think if you think about it, as we always used to kind of look at it, Glenn, and say, even in a bullying relationship, we have to, it's not just always, we have to support the target, we have to really support the bully, because they're also going through something, and it's very similar, that we do have to support, our educators as they are going through this same environment. So that's very, very important. We have to support both sides. So do we have anything that shows that, kids are acting out, that we do have specifically, maybe students? This is Mark from Ohio. Anything that students we've never had problems with before, but now they're acting out because maybe they're internalizing, some of these fears that we've talked about in the trauma. Have we heard anything along those lines?
Well, I definitely think, that Mark is correct, that absolutely is happening. It's just we don't have the traditional peer-reviewed research, that bears it out yet. In a few short years, we will have that. But I think that's absolutely correct. I think that there's, we have to be able to look past the immediate outward behavior to see what's going on underneath, to see what has, and it's that underneath is where the things that are internalized, as Mark was mentioning there. And I think that very much is tied to some of what we're going through now. Sometimes to what a kid is doing and what a kid is going through, it has nothing to do with the pandemic or anything. But that's why we need to develop our skills and our ability to be able to recognize what lies underneath. What are like the root causes of this? Like, well, Kevin, like sometimes we would run into situations where kids would get into trouble because they brought a weapon to school. Oh, that's completely against the policy. You can't have, and you shouldn't, there should be a policy, no weapons in schools, but you have to figure out why, and oftentimes kids aren't even asked. It's like, here's the policy. You're automatically suspended for so long or whatever it might be. But if you ask the kid, it's like, I'm afraid. Well, got to keep asking questions. What are you afraid of? I'm being terrorized here, at school. Well, how's that happening? Share with me. Can you share with me how's that happening? Those are the things that are underneath, but usually we get caught up in just the immediate outward. And that's where, that's easier to deal with, the outward tangible thing. You brought a knife, that's it. You're out for whatever the period of time is, that kind of a thing. It's much harder and takes more time to sit down and really listen. Yeah. That's where empathy comes in.
I think Rachel asked a question about what studies are being done. Do we know any studies are being done? Because this also kind of goes back to sometimes at the beginning, you have to go on what's anecdotal.
Yeah.
You have to go on what we hear, what we're seeing, what we're being told. But I don't know if there's any studies that are, I'm sure there are going to be studies that come out of this. But I think also, this is from Angie in Georgia. Have we ever had like a mass traumatic experiences that impacted children like this before? People will probably think about the flu epidemic. But have we ever had anything that has kept students, like out of schools and impacted them as much?
I'm not exactly sure. I think definitely, diseases can keep any people, young or old, out of school. I think when we have national events and tragedies, whether they're natural disasters, can sometimes keep kids out of school, but that's usually for, a limited period of time.
Right.
We had World War II. I'm not sure, how education was going during some parts of that, because the war was not being fought on, our soil.
Right.
I think probably, though, if you go back to the Civil War, where war was actually being fought on our ground during the years of that, I think we would likely find that education for children was severely disrupted as the war went on, especially as the Northern armies moved through the South and that. I mean, you've got towns that are burning and that. I don't think you're there studying your mathematics, in the school building and that. That is an excellent question. And I do agree with Kevin that studies will be done about this. I'm not immediately aware of anything, because part of the problem is I think we're still, although some want to move away from this, I think we're still in a period of time where we're trying to get our medical abilities and everything, our arms around what is happening and what will be happening as we move into the winter.
Yeah, when I read the question, one of the first things came to my mind, a couple of people in the chat of 9/11, that was an impact on students. But I think it's for some, yes, it has really impacted them for their lives, depending on where you were and what you were doing. And we now see the children of 9/11,
and there's another thing too, if I can mention. I remember early on, as people were going into the hospital with COVID, they were just using the traditional medical protocols, when to intubate people and stuff like that. And then some doctors and even some nurses, as they began to have person after person coming in, they recognized, wait a minute, if we, instead of having people on their back, if we put them on their stomach, they're breathing better. If we don't put them on intubators, so quickly, they're not dying as much and stuff. And so it's kind of like, we're in the field work of it, and it's like, fine, later we'll study it, we'll write it up. But right now, when I flip this person over on their stomach, they're breathing better. I don't care that there's not a study about it. My patient is breathing better. So if I was in the classroom and if I was in a school, I would watch and see what works and do what works. And then later collect the data and do the publishing.
Yeah. And coming out of that, Michelle from Grand Blanc, and then also let me find this other question. Erica from Chicago they both kind of want to know, what are resources, where should people kind of go to? And then are there also special education resources for supporting special education students during this time? So resources, that's what I think some teachers are also out there looking for beyond their own school. Are there anywhere they should turn?
I'm really glad that this situation with special needs children have been brought up. I think that they are a unique category that has suffered in some very significant ways. I know this on a personal basis. I have a grandson that is in that category, and being trapped in an apartment for months on end, where he was, and cut off from the special education, people and resources at the school, compounded the problems he had and made everything more difficult at home for him, for his younger brother and his mom and dad. Mm-hmm. So being cut off from those, those resources, it had a significant impact for children with special needs. My encouragement, I can't think immediately of any website that I could give you, but certainly reconnecting with those in special education, at your schools and whatever the intermediate school district, might have available. Also community mental health. I'm just so glad that it came up, because that is the direction we need to move and, continue to move, is reconnecting these children and their families with these resources, even in just some basic ways as giving the parents some respite, because for a period of time, you couldn't even have anybody in your house and that. So as Kevin has said before, there's people we need to support on all sides of these issues.
So, of course, somebody needs to know, what does KPA stand for again?
Oh, Kapa. I did it because I'm a Star Trek fan, and it sounds Klingon, but it's totally
Sounds very Klingon.
It sounds Kapa, but it's very not Klingon, because it's kindness, patience, and adaptability. And if you would watch the Windemere, Windermere, the Windemere Children, and have Kapa there on a little piece of paper, I think you will see it. And what I'm saying, and again, I've never given this kind of reference before for people or suggestion as a resource. I'm suggesting that movie and that documentary as a resource.
Right.
It won't be identical, but there'll be principles and even practical things, like, for instance, time constraints on children and bringing back in nature and art. They had a wonderful art teacher who just gave the kids a paper and paint and things and just let them do it. It wasn't like, oh, here's how you have to paint, and everybody paint this object over here that I'm going to set up. I'm going to teach you about colors and lighting and shape. No, she just put the paper down in front of them and just let them paint. Didn't judge it, and sure enough, things that the kids couldn't say, started coming out. Where are the pictures, similar pictures of the pandemic? I mean, if I was an art teacher, that's one thing I'd be doing in schools.
That is an awesome exercise, because I remember after I did a talk at a school for kindergartners, at the end of the day, the kindergarten teacher talked with them and say, now draw pictures of what Mr. Epling talked about. And I still have those pictures, and they're fascinating what their interpretation of what I said was. So it's incredible in their minds how they perceive things from what we do.
I guess that would be the final thing that I would say, Kevin, because I know we're almost at the end of our time now. Empathy is different than sympathy. Sympathy is just like saying to people, well, geez, that must be really hard. That sounds like a difficult thing. Empathy allows you to enter a person's world and actually to enter their pain. And it puts you there so you can see what they're seeing and to some degree feel what they're feeling. That's where we have to start in order to be able to help them. We can't just take our adult knowledge and apply it to them. We have to be able to enter their world, see what they're experiencing. That's going to inform what our treatment and our approach is for them.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that answers, Lisa, this is your question. If we are ignoring the trauma by rushing back to normal, will it come back to harm us later? And I think,
Yes.
We've kind of seen in what you've done in your work and domestic violence. That is what happens, Lisa. So it's by all of us working together on this and looking at it from a different perspective. We can do more, and we just have to open ourselves up to that. I think I'm going to take one last question for you, Glenn, and then we're going to go to a break. This is from our direct message. How do you delicately, because you have a grandson, so you have talked to him about this. How do you delicately start to talk with a child and also staff about the COVID child? And how do we need to evaluate what we must be doing and thinking about going back, to Maslow's hierarchy of needs? So how do you do that? How do you talk to the staff about what you're talking about, this concern about the children of the pandemic?
Yeah. Do we have another hour, Kevin? That is amazing.
Yeah, I know it's a loaded question, but I think you just
amazing question.
have to start the conversation.
Yeah. I think in starting the conversation, we have to put There's been so many statistics that are pushed out about COVID, and we're always looking at charts. I think what we have to do is we have to become vulnerable. It's almost counterintuitive, but oftentimes as parents, when we go to schools, there can sometimes be a bit of an adversarial relationship, and that's very challenging. So when I'm saying to become vulnerable can seem counterintuitive, but it probably is the thing that will may cause that person on the other end, the educator, to pause and actually listen to you.
Yeah.
You have to share not statistics, but you have to put the human face on it, which is the face of your child, which is a narrative, which probably then means bringing in some of your own weaknesses, or what you might see as, shortcomings or frustrations as a parent. Share the story of your child, not just the condition. My grandson has a condition, but he has a story. He's a person. And we need to be better storytellers. And hopefully, people are just sometimes a little more open to hearing a story rather than hearing just a bunch of facts and statistics thrown at them.
Yep. Glenn, always awesome to hear from you, and just kind of keep all this going. I think it is, it's just great.